I remember when I was about your size, I thought time was forever and grown-ups were wise. I believed wind in the leaves of the cottonwood tree was whispering something, maybe singing to me. I stood late in the yard listening hard, but the leaves would fall or my mother would call. In bed, when I closed my eyes on the day, I imagined more than I knew how to say. I wondered if there was someone like me in some other world or some galaxy shaped like a rose or a disc or a flame, if he looked like me or had a similar name, if she loved and feared the same things I do. And the longer I wondered, the older I grew. I'm telling you this, I don't know why. But if you ever meet her, tell her I tried to live what the wind requested of me as it sang down the leaves of that cottonwood tree. Art enters our lives a long time before we know it's art. So this is a poem, goes back to Western Kentucky. It's about my first poetry lesson. It's called Memories of Pentecost. I had an uncle who healed by faith and drove a Lincoln. Smack in the middle of the forehead with the palm of his hand, and the eyes wobbled in their sockets. Sound like a ribbon unfurled from the tongue. It might have been Hebrew, it might have been Chickasaw. It may have had something to do with marrying cousins. Who's to say it wasn't the blow of grace itself? The organist beating the hymn like a bad child, the ceiling fan spinning as if the roof might fly away, and even if the Spirit missed me by an eyelash, a whisker, a country mile, even if Sunday after Sunday I dodged the white arrow that pierced the true apostles, it was enough to know it was somewhere in the family, somewhere in my uncle, flapping like a wild bird in his chest as he touched them, as he let them go, the organ swooping down like a train at a crossing as he danced his little dance, one step, then a wiggle, sweet Jesus, sweet jangle, the keys to the Lincoln alive in his pocket. It's funny, I felt like I had this deprived childhood. No books. We had a cookbook and a King James Bible, and it really literally took me years and years before I realized that all those Sundays and all those Southern Methodist and Baptist and Pentecostal pews, I was learning the power of words, particularly rhythmically spoken words, that the invisible was floating in upon those words. And so it's interesting how it affects our lives. We may think poetry is out there somewhere, or we may have had a bad experience in the 7th or 8th grade with poetry. It's like having iambic pentameter, so that kind of blocks some of our brain. But poetry is a pretty natural part of the human of a human being. It's that distance between what you know yourself to be, what you feel inside, and what you're able to relate to other people. And that sometimes is quite a long distance, a great distance. Poetry is one of the vehicles for traversing that distance. And anyone who hasn't felt that distance between what they know themselves to be, how they really feel at any given moment, and what they express to others around them, anyone who hasn't felt that probably doesn't need poetry. But I haven't met anyone yet. It also doesn't have to start very big. This is a poem about the tiniest element in the universe. And that element, hydrogen, is well represented here today, I might say. So this is a poem called Hydrogen, and I'm going to dedicate it to the bass player over there. A balloon, a bomb, a drop of water, the skin around the sun burning outward. You are truly next to nothing, and yet everywhere. So neighborly, so eager to combine. When oxygen decided to swim, you only ask, how far? When tears needed a catalyst, you solemnly stepped forth. In every cell, plant or animal, it's just not the same without you. It's not the same ocean or body, it's not the rain or snow, and still, such a vulnerable element, just a proton, huddled under the wavering attentions of a lone electron. A body composed mainly of the distance between you. A fragile marriage, which, if it ends, may end badly. And your loss breed a loneliness so deep, as tiny as you are, the whole world withdraws in consolation. It sounds just like that. I was going to do more elements, but I got so depressed after hydrogen was done. I decided to just kind of take it easy on the elements for a while. Well, I wish I could dance. I'd like to do something like that. What else do I have to say here? A poem about fall. Wait a minute. I gathered this. Ginkgo leaves. These are my. This is my multimedia. 2 ginkgo leaves. They're not in the poem, but I just think they're pretty. The morning after. The morning after the first clean wind of fall, we wake in a tangle of sheets. The morning swings from the blood, tightens in the breath. Our sleep is still loose upon our bodies. We find ourselves moving in the light of new instructions, breathing deeper, walking faster. We sense an edge and a thought lacing the shadow of that edge. A thought we recognize, have held many times before. If this was the year for our lives to occur, the wind pulls gray into the hedge. They should be occurring, even now. So, until this moment, the 2 favorite moments of this day so far for me have been jogging in Eau Claire this morning along the Eau Claire River at just the moment, and by jogging I mean barely jogging, but I was jogging, and at that moment the wind caught this long row of locust trees, and the little yellow locust leaves were just fluttering and spinning down, and I was running through them, and I was like, all this confetti for me, I felt it was such a beautiful moment. The other moment, I'm not sure that this has anything to do with the poem, but it was in Mega Foods right before I took off on the road, and this little girl walked in with her mother, and she ran over to another little girl who was obviously a friend of hers, and she didn't know she was going to be at Mega Foods, and she grabbed and hugged this girl, and they just were hugging, and then her mother dragged her off to go shopping, and she came back and hugged the girl again, hugged her goodbye. And then I saw her as she walked away from that little girl who was her friend. Also, the little girl, she was wearing a tutu. She was about 4 years old. And she was just vibrating with happiness that she had actually run into her friend, who she probably hadn't seen since yesterday. And so my ambition is to feel that way again from seeing somebody. Maybe it's possible. I don't know. How am I going to follow? That story meant nothing to the poetry lesson. It's just I've been thinking about that little girl all day long. Oh well, closest I can come is I will tell you the only other thing besides Poet Laureate of Wisconsin I was ever elected was King of the 5th grade in Concord Elementary School in Paducah, Kentucky. And it wasn't that big a deal because it was a very small school and a different boy had to be king each year. So by the 5th grade, there were only a couple of us there left who hadn't been king. And this poem is really about, well, I was king, sure, and I had an aluminum foil crown. And the problem was I was really, really tiny in the 5th grade. I was about this, and the queen was like a grown woman. You know, in the 5th grade, things aren't fair between males and females. And so, you know, even with my crown, I wasn't tall enough for the queen of the 5th grade. And so really, in a sense, this poem is about the day I learned I was not king material. Because and the sooner you learn that, the better. Yeah, because you left me a handful of daffodils, I suddenly thought of Brenda Hatfield, queen of the 5th grade, Concord Elementary. A very thin, shy girl, almost as tall as Audrey Hepburn, but blonde. She wore a dress based upon the principle of the daffodil. Puffed sleeves, inflated bodice, profusion of frills along the shoulder blades and hemline. A dress based upon the principle of girl as flower. Everything unfolding, spilling, outward and downward, ribbon, stole, corsage, sash. It was the only thing I was ever elected, a very short king. I wore a bow tie and felt like a 3rd grader. Even the scent of the daffodils you left reminds me. It was a spring night, and escorting her down the runway was a losing battle. Trying to march down among the full, thick folds of crinoline, into the barrage of her father's flashbulbs, wading the backwash of her mother's perfume. Scared, smiling, tiny, down at the end of that long, thin Audrey Hepburn arm, where I was king. I felt very unkingly. And I think now with 2 months left as Poet Laureate of the state, that poem has come to represent my feeling about trying to represent something as audacious as poetry, you know, around the state. I mean, any of 500, 1,000 people could do this, people in this town, and Racine, Kenosha. I got picked, I don't know, maybe they needed someone from the Outlands over there near Eau Claire. But it is really something when you, I grew up in a field in western Kentucky. My mother eloped. My parents just celebrated their 67th wedding anniversary, so eloping works. Any of you considering it? It certainly works. It seemed like the weirdest thing in the world to even contemplate. I didn't know there were living poets. I thought poets were like ancient Greek philosophers. They sort of had existed once, but no more. And it was, I went through all of college without even studying a living poet. Except one class, we studied W.H. Auden, and he died right in the middle of the class. So I've always suspected that they had him knocked off because they felt that it was a living poet. One of the good things about my students now and people now is they have examples of living poets. And they are being re-reminded tonight and often that poetry is an oral art form, that it exists on the page and you can put down and complicate things on the page a lot, and that's what I do mostly, but also it needs to be heard and it needs to be shared. And if you've ever sung a hymn or been to a funeral or a christening or a baptism, or if you have ever been in a conversation and someone has said something particularly melodious or eloquent and you've thought, wow, that's poetry, what you just said, by which you probably mean, I've never heard anyone put it that well before, if you've ever done that. And as I said before, if you've just ever understood that in spite of all of the devices in our pockets right now, with which we have people, seeking to vibrate our very beings with little messages and advertisements, sales pitch, political propaganda. It's being bombarded from 20,000 miles above us right at this very moment. And yet we're no closer than we ever were. The things that we really have to say, the things that we really feel from the depths of our being are not articulated any more than they ever were. And maybe we're even being seduced into thinking that being connected means that you are actually somehow revealing yourself and expressing who you are. Poetry is more needed, as a matter of fact, than ever. And I'm grateful that at least poetry is back in the air. If you've ever memorized part of a song, that's poetry too. Poetry is pretty much, I hate to say this, but it's common as dirt. As a matter of fact, I think the first encounter of poetry I had was in Genesis when the Spirit came down and animated the dirt. And what came of that was a living soul to some extent. That's before it became a backslider. But maybe I should read one poem and then go somewhere. By the way, when I was called at the end of December I don't remember if I said this in Kenosha 6 months ago, but I was in a bar in Eau Claire. It was freezing, well, it was way below freezing. I was drinking a beer of Wisconsin origin, and believe it or not, I mean, this is stupid. If someone wrote this in a short story, I would say this is too corny, but I was actually eating deep fried cheese curds, drinking a local beer, Kugel's, it's creamy dark, and the cell phone went off. I ignored it, and then finally it rang again. And I went over by the coat rack, and they told me, okay, you're poet laureate, like you're it. And I told them, as a matter of fact, I'm on the panel now, and they have to pick a new one within 2 months. And I said, if you call the person that you select, and it's January, and it's December, and it's very cold, and it's night, and they're not in a Wisconsin bar, drinking a Wisconsin beverage and eating cheese curds, just go down the list. And you will find the right poet laureate sooner or later. I'm quite sure of that. What else? Yeah, I think I'll just, I don't know. Maybe I won't read a poem. I think I remember this poem. It would be a good one to end on because it's kind of quiet now. The best things in life are the most expensive, in spite of what the Beatles said. The best things in life are the most expensive. Grass, for instance, which shines with the wet light of morning and lines the bottoms of small baskets in valleys, costing all the way from the center of the sun, photons pinballing their way to the unfurling corona, and then smack into the sheen on the face of the grass. And snowfall, which is the bread of heaven, though broken by the time it gets here, but lovely when wind-carved and shattered into spectral bits by low angles of light. And kissing, which cost approximately a fortune in souped-up chemistry and repercussions, betrayals and strollers and sonetry, and then all those shopping days until remorse is done. And music, which cost 1,000,000 years of birds and wolves and longing to learn. And words, which well up and want to be, but nerve is missing, and must be hunted up and down the corridors of the spine, separated out from the more plentiful cut-rate words that shine a little but soon wreck or stick or cease to console. So expensive, hardly less than unaffordable are the best things. Time and memory and forgetting, water wearing over rocks it took half the life of the planet to form, and wishing you could hear it all more deeply and longer, and also silence.